Chapter 8. Jos Merlin was drunk for 5 days. He was unconscious most of the time, and lay stretched out on a bed in the kitchen that Mary and her aunt had made up. He slept with his mouth wide open, and the sound of his breathing could be heard from the bedrooms above. At about 5 in the evening, he would wake for about half an hour, shouting for drink and crying like a child. His wife went to him immediately, talking to him gently, holding a glass to his lips, and he looked wildly around, talking to himself and trembling like a frightened dog. Aunt Patience became another woman, showing a calm, which Mary would not have believed her to possess. It seemed that every 2 months or so Jos Merlin would have these periods of uncontrolled drinking. They were becoming more frequent, and Aunt Patience was never quite certain when they would happen. On the 5th morning, the wind dropped and the sun shone, and in spite of the adventure of a few days before, Mary decided to try the moors again. This time she made for the East Moor, walking towards Kilmer. With many hours of daylight to come, there was no danger of being lost. Mary had walked for an hour or more before she stopped, her progress barred by a stream that divided and ran in different directions. It lay in a valley in the hills, and was surrounded by marshes. The country was not unknown to her. Looking out beyond the green face of the Tor ahead, she saw the great hand of Kilmer pointing its fingers to the sky. She was looking at True Waerda Moor once again, where she had wandered that first Saturday, but this time her face was turned to the southeast, and the hills looked different in the sunshine. The stream ran cheerfully over the stones. As Mary crossed it by a rough bridge, a group of horses came down the hill beyond and pushed into the stream to drink. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a man following them down the path, carrying a bucket in each hand. She was about to continue her walk when he waved a bucket in the air and shouted to her. It was Jem Merlin. There was no time to escape, so she stood where she was until he came to her, looking just as his brother must have looked 20 years ago. "So you've found your way to me, have you?" he said. "I didn't expect you so soon, or I'd have made some bread in your honor. I haven't washed for 3 days and I've been living on potatoes. Here, take hold of this bucket." He pushed one of the buckets into her hand and ran down to the water after the horses. "Come out of it!" he shouted. "Dirtying my drinking water. Go on, you big black devil." He hit the largest of the horses with the end of the bucket, and they all ran back up the hill, kicking their feet in the air. "What would you have done if you hadn't found me at home?" he said, wiping his face on his arm. Mary could not help smiling. "I didn't even know you lived here, and I certainly never walked this way with the intention of finding you. I'd have turned left if I'd known. I don't believe you." You started out with the hope of seeing me, and it's no use pretending anything different. He led the way up the path and, turning the corner, they came to a small gray house built on the side of the hill. There were some rough farm buildings at the back, and a piece of land for potatoes. She followed him in, bending her head under the low doorway. The room was small and square. Mary looked around her in disgust. "Don't you ever do any cleaning?" she asked him. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Leave me that bucket of water and find me a brush." She set to work immediately. "How long has your mother been dead?" "7 years this Christmas," he answered. "Because of my father being hanged and Matt drowned and Joss gone off to America and me growing up wild, she turned religious, and used to pray here by the hour, calling on the Lord. I couldn't bear that, so I ran away to sea. But the sea didn't suit my stomach, and I came back home. I found Mother very thin." "You ought to eat more," I said. But she wouldn't listen to me, so I went off again and stayed in Plymouth for a time, earning a little in my own way. I came back and found the place empty and the door locked. They told me my mother had died. She'd been buried 3 weeks. What's the matter? It'll be a good thing when there's not a Merlin left in Cornwall. It's better to have disease in a country than a family like yours. You and your brothers were born twisted and evil. Do you never think of what your mother must have suffered?" Jim looked at her in surprise. "Mother was all right. She never complained. She was used to us." "How's the landlord of Jamaica Inn, then?" "He's had too much to drink, like his father before him. That'll be the ruin of Joss," said his brother seriously. "One day he'll kill himself with drink. The fool." "Has anything been happening at Jamaica Inn?" "We had Mr. Bissett from North Hill last week." "You did? What did the magistrate have to say to you?" "Uncle Joss was away from home. Mr. Bissett was determined to come into the inn and search the rooms. He broke down the door at the end of the passage, but the room was empty. He seemed disappointed, and very surprised, and he rode away in a bad temper. He asked about you, as it happened, and I told him I had never seen you." Jim's face was without expression as she told her story, but when she came to the end of her sentence, and the mention of himself, he laughed. "Why did you lie to him?" he asked. "It seemed less trouble at the time. If I'd thought longer, no doubt I'd have told him the truth." "You've got nothing to hide, have you?" "Nothing much, except that the black horse you saw by the stream belongs to him. He was grey last week, and worth small fortune to Mr. Bissett. I'll get a few pounds for him at Launceston if I'm lucky. Come down and have a look at him. They went out into the sun. Then Jim spoke again. What did Mr. Bassett expect to see at Jamaica Inn? Mary looked him straight in the eyes. You ought to know that better than I do, she answered. It was lucky for Joss that everything had been moved, he said quietly. It's only a matter of time before they catch him. All he does in self-defense is to get drunk, the fool. Mary said nothing. If Jim was trying to trap her by his openness, he would be disappointed. You must have a good view from that little room over the front door, he said. Do they wake you from your sleep? How do you know that's my room? Mary asked quickly. She saw the surprise in his eyes. Then he laughed. The window was wide open when I rode into the yard the other morning. I've never seen a window open at Jamaica Inn before. The excuse was hardly good enough for Mary, and a horrible suspicion came into her mind. Could it have been Jim who had hidden in the empty guest room that Saturday night? Something went cold inside her. What does it matter to you how much I know? All I think about is getting my end away from the place as soon as possible. As for your brother, he can drink himself to death for all I care. His life is his own, and so is his business. It's nothing to do with me. Jim whistled. So smuggling doesn't worry you after all? But supposing he were concerned with other things, supposing it were a question of life and death, and perhaps murder, what then? I don't know what you mean, said Mary. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Perhaps not, he said at last, but you'll come to know, if you stay long enough. Why does your aunt look so pale? Ask her, next time the wind blows from the northwest. Why are you going? It's early yet, it won't be dark until after 4. What's the matter with you? He took her face in his hands and looked into her eyes. I believe you're frightened of me. You think I've got boxes of wine and spirits and tobacco in the little bedrooms above, and that I'm going to show them to you, and then cut your throat. That's it, isn't it? We're a wild lot, we Merlins, and Jim is the worst of us all. Is that what you're thinking? She smiled back at him in spite of herself. Something of the sort. But I'm not afraid of you, you needn't think that. I would even like you, if you didn't remind me so much of your brother. I can't help my face, he said, and I'm a much better looking man than Joss, you must admit that. Oh, you've confidence enough to make up for all the other qualities you lack, and I'll not argue about your face. Now let me go. Are you coming to Launceston with me on Christmas Eve? What will you be doing over at Launceston, Jim Merlin? Only selling Mr. Bassett's horse for him, my dear. Say you'll come. Supposing you were caught in Launceston with Mr. Bassett's horse? No one's going to catch me. Take a risk, Mary, don't you like excitement? You must be soft, down near Halford. All right, Jim Merlin. You needn't think that I'm afraid. I'd be just as happy in prison as at Jamaica Inn, anyway. How do we get to Launceston? I'll take you there in my carriage, with Mr. Bassett's horse tied up behind us. Mary was not afraid of him. To prove it, she would ride beside him to Launceston on Christmas Eve. She walked away up the hill without a backward look. Darkness was falling as she crossed the road and entered the yard at Jamaica Inn. The door was opened by her aunt, who seemed pale and anxious. Your uncle has been asking for you all day. Where have you been? I was walking on the moors. Why should Uncle Jos ask for me? He never has anything to say to me. You must speak nicely to him. This is the bad time, when he's getting over it. He'll be bad-tempered, violent perhaps. You mustn't pay any attention to him at times like these. He's not really himself. The long evening passed, and still there was no call from the landlord. Mary's eyes closed in spite of herself. In a dream, she heard her aunt whisper, "I'm going to bed." Your uncle must have settled down for the night. Mary felt sleep come over her. She dreamed that she was crossing the stream again. Her feet were wet. It was cold. Much too cold. She must climb up the bank. Mary opened her eyes and found that she was lying on the kitchen floor beside the ashes of the fire. The kitchen was cold. The light was low. She trembled, and stretched her stiff arms. Then she saw the door of the kitchen open very slowly, little by little. Suddenly it was thrown wide open, and Jos Merlin stood there. At first, she thought that he had not seen her. His eyes were fixed on the wall in front of him. She bent low, her head beneath the level of the table, hearing nothing except the steady beating of her heart. Slowly he turned in her direction. When his voice came, it was hardly above a whisper, "Who's there? What are you doing? Why don't you speak?" His face was gray. His eyes looked towards her without recognition. Mary did not move. She waited, holding her breath. He moved forward into the room, his head bent, his hands feeling the air, and he crept slowly along the floor towards her until Mary could feel his breath on her face. "Uncle Jos," she said softly, "Uncle Jos." He stayed where he was, looking down at her, and then he leaned forward and touched her. "Mary? Is it you, Mary? Why don't you speak to me? Where have they gone? Have you seen them? You've made a mistake, Uncle Jos," she said. There's no one here, only myself. And Patience is upstairs. Are you ill? Can I help you? He looked around him in the half-light, searching the corners of the room. They can't frighten me, he whispered. Dead men can't harm the living. It's dreams, all dreams. Their faces stand out like living things in the darkness, and I wake trembling. I'm thirsty, Mary, here's the key, go into the bar and find me something to drink. When she got back, he was sitting at the table with his head in his hands. At first, she thought that he was asleep again, but at the sound of her footsteps, he lifted his head. She put the bottle and the glass on the table in front of him. He filled the glass. You're a good girl. I'm fond of you, Mary. You've got sense, and you've got courage. They ought to have made you a boy. He swallowed the drink, smiling foolishly. Then he pointed at the bottle. They pay gold for this. It's the best that money can buy. King George himself hasn't anything better. They can't catch me, Mary, I'm too clever, I've been at the game too long. There are over 100 of us now, working towards the border from the coast. I've seen blood in my time, Mary, and I've seen men killed many times, but this game beats it all, it's running side by side with death. He seized hold of Mary's arm. It's that cursed drink that makes a fool of me. I'm as weak as a rat when it has hold of me, you can see that. And I have dreams, I see things that frighten me. I've killed men with my own hands, pushed them underwater with my feet, beaten them with rocks and stones, and I've never thought more about it, I've slept in my bed like a child. But when I've had too much to drink I see them in my dreams. I see their white-green faces in front of me, with their eyes eaten by fish, and some of them are torn, with the flesh hanging off their bones. His face was close to Mary's, his reddened eyes looking into hers, and his breath on her cheek. Did you never hear of wreckers before? He whispered. I've seen men hanging on the ropes of their ships for safety, shouting in terror at the sight of the breaking waves. Just like flies they are, spread out on the ropes, little black dots of men. I've seen the ship break up beneath them, and the ropes break like thread, and all of them thrown into the sea, to swim for their lives. But when they reach the shore they're dead men, Mary. He wiped his mouth on the back of his hand, his eyes never left her face. Dead men tell no stories, Mary. She felt sick, and her hands and her feet were icy cold. She could see the pale faces of the drowned men, their arms above their heads, she could hear the cries of fear. She trembled again. She looked at her uncle, and saw that he had slipped forward in his chair, and his head had fallen on his chest. His mouth was wide open, and he breathed noisily as he slept. His arms rested on the table in front of him, and his hands were folded as if in prayer. Chapter 9. On Christmas Eve, the sky was cloudy and threatened rain. Mary leaned out of the window, and the soft wet wind blew on her face. In an hour's time, Jim Merlin would be waiting for her on the moor, to take her to Launceston Market. Whether she met him or not depended on herself, and she could not make up her mind. She had grown older in 4 days, and the face that looked back at her from her cracked mirror was pale and tired. There were dark rings under her eyes. Sleep came to her late at night, and she had no desire for food. For the first time in her life, she saw a likeness between herself and Aunt Patience. If she tightened her mouth and bit her lips, it could be Aunt Patience who stood there, with the straight brown hair framing her face. The habit of working her mouth was an easy one to catch, as was the continuous twisting of her hands. Mary turned away from the mirror and began to walk up and down her small room. They shared a secret now, a secret that must never be spoken between them. Mary wondered how many years Aunt Patience had kept that knowledge to herself in silence. In her own way, Aunt Patience was a murderer too. She had killed by her silence. There remained Jim Merlin. He broke into her thoughts against her will, and she did not want him there. She had enough on her mind without Jim. He was too like his brother. His eyes, and his mouth, and his smile. She knew why Aunt Patience had made a fool of herself 10 years ago. It would be easy enough to fall in love with Jim Merlin. He was rough, he was rude, he was a thief and a liar. He stood for everything she feared and hated, but she knew she could love him. Jim Merlin was a man, and she was a woman, and something inside her wanted him. She knew she would have to see him again. Today she would go to Launceston, and this time it was he who would answer her questions. He would realize that she was no longer afraid of the Merlins, but could destroy them when she chose. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow could take care of itself. There was always Francis Davy and his promise. There would be peace and shelter for her in the house at Alternon. This was a strange Christmas, she thought, as she walked across the East Moor. In the distance, she saw a little group coming towards her, the horse, the cart, and 2 horses led behind. The driver raised his whip in a signal of welcome. Mary felt the color in her face. He whistled as he came near, and threw a package at her feet. "A happy Christmas to you," he said. "I had a silver piece in my pocket, so I had to spend it." "There's a new hat for you." She had meant to be silent on meeting him, but this made it difficult. "That's very kind of you," she said, "but I'm afraid you've wasted your money. That doesn't worry me. I'm used to it," and he looked at her in that cool way of his. "You were here early. Were you afraid I'd go without you?" She climbed up beside him. "Mother and I used to drive into Helford once a week on market days. It all seems very long ago. It hurts me when I think of it, and how we used to laugh together, even when times were bad. You wouldn't understand that, of course. You've never cared for anything but yourself." They rode along in silence. Jim was playing with his whip. Mary looked out of the corner of her eye at his hands, and saw that they were long and thin. They had the same strength, the same sensitivity, as his brother's. These hands attracted her, the others frightened her. She realized for the first time that love and hate ran side by side, that the borderline was thin between them. The thought was an unpleasant one. Supposing this had been just beside her, 10, 20 years ago. She pushed the comparison to the back of her mind, fearing it. She knew now why she hated her uncle. His voice interrupted her thoughts. "What are you looking at?" She lifted her eyes. "I happened to notice your hands," she said shortly. "They are like your brother's." "How far do we go across the moor?" "Isn't that the road over there? We join it lower down and miss 2 or 3 miles of it." "So you notice a man's hands, do you? I should never have believed it of you." "You're a woman after all, then, and not a half-grown farm boy. Are you going to tell me why you have sat in your room for days, or do you want me to guess?" Women love to be mysterious. There's no mystery in it. "You asked me last time we met why my aunt looked as she does. Well, I know now, that's all. What are you going to do about it?" Mary said, "I haven't made up my mind. I have to consider Aunt Patience." "You don't expect me to tell you, do you? Why not?" "I'm not concerned with Joss. You're his brother, and that's enough for me. Do you think I'd waste my time working for my brother? He can put a rope round his own neck. I may have helped myself to some tobacco now and then, and I've smuggled goods, but I'll tell you one thing, Mary Ellen, and you can believe it or not as you like, I've never killed a man, yet." He cracked the whip part over the horse's head. "So you think I wreck ships, do you, and stand on the shore and watch men drown? And then put my hands into their pockets afterwards, when they're swollen with water?" It makes a pretty picture. Whether his anger was pretended or sincere she could not say, but his mouth was set firmly and there was a flaming spot of color high on his cheek. "You haven't said yet that you don't. If you believe it of me, why do you drive with me to Launceston? Because of your bright eyes, Jim Merlin. I ride with you for no other reason, and she met his eyes with a directness that surprised him. He laughed at that, and shook his head, and began whistling again, and suddenly there was a relaxed familiarity between them. The very directness of her words had deceived him. He suspected nothing of the weakness that lay behind them, and for the moment, they were companions in spite of being man and woman. They came now to the road, and as the horse increased speed, the cart rolled along, with the two stolen horses running behind. It was a happy and rather heated party that reached Launceston that afternoon. Mary had thrown worry and responsibility to the winds, and in spite of her determination in the morning, she had given herself to enjoyment. Away from the shadow of Jamaica Inn, her national youth and high spirits returned. She laughed because he made her laugh, there was excitement in the air, a sense of Christmas, the streets were filled with people, the little shops were bright and cheerful. This was a world that Mary loved. She wore the hat that Jim had given her and even allowed him to tie the ends under her chin. They had left the horse and carriage at the top of the town, and now Jim pushed his way through the crowd, leading his two stolen horses, Mary following close behind him. He led the way with confidence, making straight for the main square. Before long, a man pushed through the crowd and came up to the horses. His voice was loud and important. He kept hitting his boot with his whip, and then pointing to the horses. Mary imagined him to be a dealer. Soon he was joined by a little sharp-eyed man in a black coat, who now and again touched his arm and whispered in his ear. Mary saw him look hard at the black horse that had belonged to Mr. Bissett. He went up to him, and bent down and felt his legs. Then he whispered something in the ear of the loud-voiced man. Mary watched him, nervously. "Where did you get this horse?" said the dealer, touching Jim on the shoulder. "Never on the moors, not with that head and shoulders. I bought him from old Tim Bray, you remember Tim? He sold his farm last year and went to Dorset. Tim always told me I'd get my money back on this horse. Have a look at him, won't you? But he's not going cheap, I'll tell you that. Look at those shoulders, there's quality for you. I tell you what, I'll take £18 for him." The sharp-eyed man shook his head, but the dealer was interested. "Make it 15 and we might do business," he suggested. "No, 18 is my price, and no less." The dealer talked to his companion, and they appeared to disagree. "All right," the dealer said finally, "I've no doubt you're right. Perhaps we would be wise to have nothing to do with it. You can keep your horse," he added to Jim. "My friend doesn't like him. Take my advice and bring down your price. If you have him for long you'll be sorry." And he pushed his way through the crowd, with the sharp-eyed man beside him, and they disappeared in the direction of the local hotel. Mary was glad to see them go. Jim sold the other horse to a cheerful, honest-looking farmer. It began to get dark in the market square, and the lamps were lit. Mary was thinking of going back to the cart when she heard a woman's voice behind her. "Oh, look, James. Did you ever see such a beautiful horse in your life? He holds his head just like poor Beauty did. The likeness would be quite striking, only this animal of course is black. What a pity Roger isn't here. He's in his meeting. What do you think of him, James?" Her companion said, "Come on, Maria, I don't know anything about horses." "The horse you lost was gray, wasn't it?" "This thing is black, coal black, my dear." "Do you want to buy him? It would be such a good Christmas present for the children. They've been begging poor Roger for another horse ever since Beauty disappeared." "Ask the price, James, will you?" The man came forward. "Here, my good man," he called to Jim, "do you want to sell that black horse of yours?" "What is your price?" £25, said Jim. "I'm not anxious to sell him." The lady swept towards him. "I'll give you 30 for him. I'm Mrs. Bissett, from North Hill, and I want the horse as a Christmas present for my children. Mr. Bissett is in Launceston now, but I want the horse to be a surprise to him as well. My man shall take the horse immediately, and ride him to North Hill before Mr. Bissett leaves the town. Here's the money." Jim took off his hat to her. "Thank you, madam," he said. "I hope Mr. Bissett will be pleased. You'll find the horse very safe with children. Oh, I'm certain he'll be very happy." Of course, the horse is not at all like the one we had stolen. Beauty was a fine horse, and worth a great deal of money. But this little animal is pretty enough, and will please the children. Come along, James, it's getting quite dark." Jim looked quickly over his shoulder, and touched on the arm a boy who stood behind him. "Here," he said, "would you like to earn some money?" The boy showed that he would, his mouth open in surprise. "Hold on to this horse, then, until the servant comes for him, will you? Here, take him. A happy Christmas to you." And he was away in a moment, walking quickly across the square, his hands in his pockets. Mary followed, 10 yards behind. She struggled to hide her laughter, and was near to bursting when they got out of sight of the people. "Jim Merlin, you deserve to be hanged," she said, when she could speak again. "To stand there in the market square and sell that stolen horse back to Mrs. Bissett herself. The hair on my head has gone gray with watching you." He threw back his head and laughed, and she could not help herself. Their laughter filled the street. Jim caught her hand. "You're glad you came now, aren't you?" They threw themselves into the crowded market, where Jim bought Mary gold rings for her ears. They sucked oranges beneath the striped tent, and had their fortunes told by an old woman. "Do not trust a dark stranger," she said to Mary, and they looked at each other and laughed again. "There's blood on your hand, young man," she told him. "You'll kill a man one day." "What did I tell you on the cart this morning?" said Jim. "There's no blood on my hands yet." "Do you believe me now?" But she shook her head at him and would not say. Drops of rain fell on their faces, but they did not care. The wind rose. Jim dragged Mary into the shelter of a doorway, his arms around her shoulders, and he turned her face towards him, and kissed her. "Do not trust a dark stranger," he said, and he laughed, and kissed her again. The night clouds had come up with the rain, and it was dark in a moment. "You don't want to ride on an open cart in this wind, do you? It's coming from the coast, and we'll be blown over on the high ground. We'll have to spend the night together in Launceston. Very likely. Go and get the horse and cart, Jim, while this rain stops for the moment. I'll wait for you here. You'll be wet to the skin on the Bodmin Road. Pretend you're in love with me, can't you? You'd stay with me then. Are you talking to me like this because I'm the bar girl at Jamaica Inn? I like the look of you, and that's enough for any man. It ought to be enough for a woman, too. Perhaps it is, for some. I'm just not made that way. All right, I'll get the horse and cart, and take you home to your aunt, but I'll kiss you first, whether you like it or not. He took her face in his hands. One for sorrow, two for joy. I'll give you the rest when you are more ready to accept them. Then he bent his head against the rain and she saw him disappear round the corner. Mary waited, moving her feet and blowing on her hands. The long minutes passed, and still he did not come. Mary was cold and tired. At last, she could bear it no longer, and she set off up the hill in search of him. The long street was empty, except for one or two people who sheltered in doorways as she had done. The rain was continuous, and the wind blew hard. There was nothing left now of the Christmas spirit. The hotel looked welcoming enough, with its lighted windows, but there was no sign of the horse and cart. Mary's heart sank. Surely, Jim had not started back without her? She paused for a moment, and then she went to the door and entered the hotel. The hall seemed to be full of gentlemen, talking and laughing. Her country clothes and wet hair caused surprise, and a servant came up to her immediately and told her to leave. "I've come in search of Mr. Jim Merlin," said Mary firmly. He came here with a horse and cart. I'm sorry to trouble you, but I'm anxious to find him. Will you please ask if he's here? She turned her back on the little group of men who stood by the fire and watched her. Among them, she recognized the dealer and the sharp-eyed man. If it's the dark one who tried to sell my friend a horse this afternoon, I can't tell you about him, said the little man, showing a row of broken teeth. Laughter came from the group by the fire. She looked from one to the other. What do you have to say? He was in the company of a gentleman only 10 minutes ago, answered the sharp-eyed man, still smiling, and looking at her rudely. With the help of some of us he was persuaded to enter a carriage that was waiting at the door. He was not keen at first, but a look from the gentleman appeared to decide him. No doubt you know what happened to the black horse? The price he was asking was undoubtedly high. His remark brought fresh laughter from the group by the fire. Mary looked steadily at the little sharp-eyed man. Do you know where he went? Number. And I'm afraid that your companion left you no parting message. But, it is Christmas. It's not pleasant weather outside. If you'd like to wait here until your friend returns, myself and these gentlemen will be happy to entertain you. Come in and rest, and forget him. Mary turned her back on him and went out through the door once more. As it closed behind her, she could hear their laughter. She stood in the empty market square with the wind and the rain for company. So the worst had happened, and the stolen horse had been recognized. There was no other explanation. Jim had gone. Did they hang men for stealing as well as for murder? She felt ill, and her brain was in confusion. She could make no plans. She supposed that Jim was lost to her now, anyway, and she would never see him again. The adventure was over. There was no happiness left in Launceston anymore. It was a cold, gray, hateful place. She walked along with the rain beating in her face, caring little where she went, or that 11 miles lay between her and her bedroom at Jamaica Inn. She walked on. Then out of the darkness, she saw a carriage coming up the hill. Its progress was slow, with the full force of the wind against it. She watched it with dull eyes. It was passing her, when suddenly she ran after it and called to the driver wrapped up in a coat on the seat. Are you taking the Bodmin Road? Have you a passenger inside? The driver shook his head and whipped his horse, but before Mary could step to one side, an arm came out of the carriage window and a hand was laid on her shoulder. What does Mary Ellen do alone in Launceston on Christmas Eve? Said a voice from inside. The voice was gentle. A pale face looked out at her from inside the carriage, white hair and white eyes beneath the broad black hat. It was the vicar of Algernon. She watched his face in the darkness, his thin nose curved down like the beak of a bird, his lips narrow and colorless, pressed firmly together. He leant forward with his chin resting on a walking stick that he held between his knees. For the moment, she could see nothing of his eyes, they were hidden by his short white eyelashes. Then he turned in his seat and looked at her, and the eyes that looked at her were white too, expressionless as glass. "So we ride together for the second time," he said, and his voice was soft and low, like the voice of a woman. "Once more I have the good fortune to help you on your way." "Well?" He looked steadily at her, and she found herself trying to give an explanation of her day. As before at Algernon, there was something about him that made her sound like a fool, for she came out of the story badly, just another woman who had made herself cheap at Launceston Market and had been left by the man of her choice to find her way home alone. "What was the name of your companion?" he asked quietly, and she paused, awkward and uncomfortable, her sense of guilt stronger than ever. "He was my uncle's brother." "You mean the brother knows nothing of the landlord's trade by night?" continued the gentle voice beside her. "He is not of the company who bring the wagons to Jamaica Inn?" "I don't know," she said. "I have no proof." "He admits nothing. But he told me one thing, that he had never killed a man. And I believe him. He also said that my uncle was running straight into the hands of the law, and that they would catch him before long. He surely would not say that if he were one of the company." "You told me before that you knew Mr. Bissett. Perhaps you have some influence with him. Could you persuade him to deal kindly with Jim Merlin, when the time comes? After all, he is young, he could start life again. It would be easy for a man in your position. I know Mr. Bissett only very slightly," he told her gently. "Once or twice we have spoken of matters which concern our two villages. It is hardly likely that he would pardon a thief because of me, especially if the thief is guilty and happens to be the brother of the landlord of Jamaica Inn." "How old are you?"